All right, here we go, everyone. Another awesome episode of the All Around Adventure podcast. And joining me today, I have David McNeill, who is the founder of Expat Empire. David, what's going on, man? Thanks so much for taking time for joining me today, and welcome to the All Around Adventure podcast.
Great to be here. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to having this conversation with you. I just took a little bit of a look into your background, and you've covered a lot of ground so far, not only just as a traveler, but also as an expatriate, having lived in multiple countries on different continents. So I'm sure, you're going to have some good stories for us today and some good insights. But kind of before we dive deep down that rabbit hole, I always like to go back to the beginning with my guests because every great traveler and adventurer has to start somewhere. So I want to hear about how you got your start. What was it that sort of led you down this path of world travel and adventure?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's always many routes that you can go in that answer because I think there are so many small things that we pick up over the years from all different people, our family, our friends, our environment. But I would say if I had to pick a couple, it would be I was fortunate enough to be able to take some early trips in my childhood with my family to places like Mexico, taking some cruises, going to Europe, for example, for a couple weeks. Nothing crazy. We didn't live abroad during that time. I guess it was kind of maybe average or kind of standard. I mean, we were certainly fortunate, but to be able to take those trips. But I think just even being able to peer just outside of what I was comfortable with, my comfort zone, broaden my horizons and understanding of different cultures and lives and just great experiences was an amazing opportunity. On top of that, my grandpa was in the Navy for 20 years. And so growing up near him, especially in my younger years, being able to hear the stories about his world travels, the world cruises that he did, all of that stuff was super compelling to me. And, it's not just this one story, but I do think there were parts of it that played a role in my decision to start studying Japanese when I was 12 years old. That's really when it started for me. And my grandpa was telling me stories of going to Japan right after World War II, like around 1950, 1951.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, just to even try to imagine what life must have looked like in such a foreign country, but especially in such a kind of unique and precarious time.
Right, yeah.
Really just somehow got inside my head. And I think all of these pieces along with, just all the right elements came together as far as starting to study Japanese for me, which was my dad told me it's probably a good time to develop a hobby. I was 12 years old. I was in middle school in the United States. And I was thinking, I tried a little music. It wasn't for me. I tried some sports. It wasn't that much for me either. And so I started, maybe a language. And then I was interested in Japanese culture with the anime, with the video games and all this stuff. And I thought, I would kind of like to be able to enjoy that in Japanese in the original, I was always watching it with subtitles as I could, but I wanted to be able to understand it. And that's kind of where it all started. But I think there were just so many different small pieces that came along the way, and I'm fortunate for how it came together and started my long journey so far.
Right on. So how old were you when you and your family actually started bumping out into the world and traveling together?
Yeah, let's see. Trying to think of the specific years, but I think I would say around 10, 11 years old. I mean, I'm sure we had some little trips here and there when I was younger. Another thing that I forgot to mention was that we moved around a lot. And I think that played a role as well, because I just saw I could uproot my life, even though I was just a child and didn't have to worry that much about packing and all that. But just with your friends, with your environment, with the school, everything, just being able to pick all that up, move to a new place and find a new group of friends, find new enjoyment, new things to do, especially moving from Mobile, Alabama to Los Angeles, California when I was in 8th grade. That's quite the change your mind. Yeah. And suddenly a whole crazy metropolis was open to me, even though I wasn't driving at the time, but just feeling that intense energy of the city compared to what I had known was a big shock, and it was a great one. So I think as far as the travel, we did, like, for example, Costa Rica, we did a trip there. We did some cruises with grandparents and things like that. Mexico a little bit. My parents actually got a timeshare in Mexico, so we would go there sometimes. And also we did like a 2-week trip around a couple cities in Europe. And that was probably around I don't know, 11, 12 years old. So I'd say that's kind of all when it was really gaining speed, and then led to the, okay, let's see how Japanese goes for me.
Right on. So you pretty much at a very young age already got a lot of practice with just adjusting to new environments, new transitions and changes and things along those lines. But at what point would you say you started venturing out into the world as a solo traveler by yourself? When did that kind of fall in the timeline?
Yeah, so I took my first trip to Japan when I was 17, and I did go with a tour group then. So I would say more maybe at 19, where I went with one friend. So it was the two of us. Although, really, I guess to move forward a little bit, when it was really just me doing it on my own, I felt like it was when I went to the National University of Singapore for a semester abroad.
Oh, wow.
And I was 20, I think, 2021. And yeah, just being able to go and do that. Of course, I went through the school's program, but at the same time, I think all of the other students from my university went in the fall semester, and I went in the spring semester. So it was an opportunity to go through a regimented school program to get the credits that I needed, but I was completely on my own from a standpoint of I didn't even have classmates from my original university. So really day one, it was walking into the cafeteria at the residence hall that I was staying at, and I just spotted some other exchange students and like, yep, I'm going to be friends with those guys. I walked over there and it worked out perfectly. So again, just seeing in so many different scenarios and situations, environments that I can just adapt to that. And that really opened my eyes to the opportunities all around the world.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's zoom in on Japan for a second here, because we got a little bit of coincidence here. Well, not really coincidence, correlation is what I meant to say, is that Japan was the first country outside of the US that I had been to. Well, I don't count Canada. Like, I'm from Michigan originally, and Canada is just, right across the bridge. So I wouldn't know if I'd really count that as like an overseas trip or anything. But Japan was the first for me. I went there for a 2-week study abroad. And, growing up, it was similar interests as you described as well. Like I'm a bit of an anime buff. I grew up watching like Dragon Ball Z and like all those like Toonami shows.
Exactly.
And of course, and I'm also a martial artist. So hearing the stories about the samurai and the ninja and everything like that just really kind of piqued my interest too. So when you first went there, what were some of the highlights from your trip? Like, where did you go? What did you experience? It's a pretty broad question, but what kind of comes to mind, from your first trip to Japan?
Yeah, so the first one was when I was 17. So it was a 1-month trip, which was including, it was a big group of high school students and teachers. So of course we had language study. We were also sightseeing, traveling around to a couple different cities. We did a homestay as well. So tons of experience there in 4 weeks. And it was just, I'm even as I'm thinking back on it now, I'm getting those chills, it was so amazing. Oh, yeah. It was so amazing. And I had been dreaming about it for those 5 years that I'd already been studying the language really passionately, really intensely studying. We even had exchange students stay over at our place in Los Angeles and things like that. So it had been all the accumulation of all of that intense interest and excitement, and it just absolutely went past anything that I expected. And I just came back so pumped up about continuing to study and eventually trying to find a way to live there. But yeah, just to talk a bit about the trip itself. We were in Tokyo, we went to Osaka, we went to Kyoto, we went to Fukuoka as well. I think that's where we had our homestay. And just we went to a middle school in Japan a couple days when we were in one city to be able to do the classes like amongst ourselves, but just to be in that environment and to feel like, quote unquote a local, but of course just for a month. It was a fantastic experience, and I just built on that at age 19 when I went back with my friend for 1 month. And just going to a lot of the same sites, the big ones, Kyoto, Tokyo, but also to many other small cities as well. And going into like a small ryokan Japanese inn with the onsen and just that whole it felt like a real deep cultural experience, even though it was a short time. I just left those 2 trips, especially the second one, and thought, I've been to Japan as a tourist. I've been here twice for 1 month each time. I've seen a ton of stuff. There's a lot more to see. I mean, Japan is packed with stuff to see, but
Right.
I just thought I want to come back, not as a tourist, but as a resident, as a local. And that was kind of my driving force going through the rest of university and post-university as well.
Yeah, there's something magical, I'll say, about Japan. And I don't know what it was for me. And this is kind of a feeling that's been hard to describe. And maybe you might have noticed this too. But I felt very like at ease, like in in that country. Meaning like I wasn't felt like I had to keep like my guard up. I don't know. I just felt safe being there. I suppose because when I went there for my 2-week study abroad, we had flown into Osaka, and I got up that next morning and like went for a run to kind of shake off the jet lag, and I don't know, there was just something about the vibe of the place where I'm just like, I feel like good here. Like the cities are clean. People are really polite and friendly. If you pass, like, let's say like elementary school kids, they'll wave to you, they're really excited to see you. And, so I don't know. I just felt very at ease at the place. What kind of sort of first impressions like did you get when you kind of first like landed in the country when you got there, and just kind of going out and starting to like explore like the cities that you had flown into?
Yeah, I felt the same way. I mean, I've always felt somehow at peace, at ease in Japan, and maybe it has something to do with the fact that even the first time I went, I'd already been studying the language for a while, so perhaps that helped. There's probably a multitude of factors, but I can't deny that feeling, as you say. I mean, it's just there, and I wanted more of that. And I've had many people over the years, especially when I was more intensely studying Japanese, when that was my goal in high school and college, and after asking, why Japan? What about Japan? And I'd always just say, I think for a second, because it's really hard to sum up that feeling. And I would just say, have you been there? And they say, no. I say, well, let's have a conversation when you have, when you come back. Right. And then inevitably, if they would go, which a lot of people do, they'd come back and say, I totally get it. Like, it's something that passes beyond an easy description, easy words. So that's been my experience. And I think, I've had a number of friends come back from trips to Japan. Of course, I'm intensely jealous that they get to experience it for the first time. And then they come back and tell me, oh man, I can't believe you actually lived there, So I think it's that type of experience. And, there are challenges, no doubt, about the culture, being a foreigner, being an outsider. You never fully feel like a local, but while you are there, it's very comfortable. So, take the pros and cons, take what you will from it.
Right. Now, I'm kind of speaking about like the culture. Of course, you had studied the language for a long time before you went there, and you kind of had like a good sense of familiarity of what I think you would expect once you actually went there. So now I'm kind of curious, when you started interacting with people when you first got there, I would imagine, and this is also why I encourage people to, kind of learn a little bit more about the culture and maybe pick up at least some of the language of like, the local language, wherever you might be going to, because there's a very powerful thing where a foreigner comes into a country and tries to interact with the locals, like in the local language or based on local customs, because I think a lot of times they might have the expectation that a tourist is going to behave like as if they're still in like their home country, you know what I mean?
Right.
So but I imagine it was probably a very powerful moment for the locals when you're going there, you're speaking in the local language and you understand the culture quite a bit and you're behaving in accordance to that. What was your experiences with interacting with people, having studied the language beforehand and, kind of having that understanding?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think every country that I've lived in, it's been a different experience. So speaking to Japan specifically, on the one hand, absolute, surprise and happiness and shock from Japanese people, from the average Japanese person, let's say. And of course, it starts there with them wondering if you can use chopsticks. And I just always tell them, like, we do eat sushi in America too. And we have Chinese food, and there are plenty of people that are proficient with chopsticks. Granted, not everybody is, and so on. So it's nice that it comes from an angle of curiosity, and of course making you want to feel comfortable, and they want to practice their English on you and things like that. But on the other hand, given that I'd studied it for so long, I'd studied Japanese for so long, to be there, and I still remember one time, this was the second trip with my buddy, we sat down at this restaurant and I just started to order the food in Japanese. And the woman taking the order, the waitress, was not able to comprehend that we were speaking Japanese and able to communicate. And so she actually took us outside of the restaurant and had us point to the plastic food in the window, which if you've been to Japan, you know there's always plastic food in the window.
Oh, yeah.
And like, I don't understand. I still really can't understand what was going through her head, except that she couldn't square the idea that somebody who's clearly physically not looking Japanese can speak Japanese to a proficient level or be able to understand her response or something. So you still get strange things like this. And you also have experiences like, we were just walking in I think we were in an aquarium or something, and a woman with her child, she had the child come up to us, not saying anything, just come up next to us and take a photo with us and walk away. Just that kind of strange stuff still happens. And I guess that trip was back in 2007. So of course, I mean, and you know, Japan, it depends where you are in the country. And of course things change over time, but yeah, you get that excitement, but also in a way the challenge of being able to prove that you can hang and that you can speak the language at a proficient level. Whereas I would just compare it for a second to a place like Germany, and arriving off the flight, they immediately expect that you're supposed to be able to speak fluent German. That's kind of the base expectation, even in a city like Berlin. And you can get along fine in a city like that, but there are plenty of times where you're clearly getting under their skin by not being able to speak the local tongue. So it's strange. I mean, I went from almost being babied, I felt like, in Japan, especially with all of those years of practice. It's like, come on, just trust that I can speak it, to going to Germany and like then feeling like in a way they expected me to integrate, which was great, but I hadn't done that, and I hadn't had the time to do that, or ultimately the long-term drive and motivation. So very different experiences, honestly.
Well, you had a little bit of different experiences, than what I had when it comes to like locals who want to try to communicate in English. When I went to Germany, like a lot of the Germans that I interacted with, they wanted to speak to me in English because they wanted to have the means to practice. You know, now they actually had like a native English speaker there with them. But when I was in Japan, I have noticed that, there was a good amount of English spoken by some of the locals. And I guess they even started learning English at a young age. When I was in Hiroshima and I went to Miyajima Island, I was on the ferry boat, my classmates and I. And there was a group of elementary students there, and they had a kind of like an English language scavenger hunt that they were doing. I guess I'll describe, but they had like a little booklet with some words and phrases in Japanese and in English. And they had to go up to who they presumed to be English speakers to like practice like their lines. Cause I'm pretty sure that their teacher felt like if they were going to take a ferry to Miyajima Island, then they're inevitably going to run into some foreigners who could probably speak English. So, and what their task was, they had to go to 5 English speakers, recite their phrases that they had on their script, and introduce themselves and ask, the person's name. And they had to get like a signature at the end to say that they've done the exercise with them. So it was kind of fun. I had all these, elementary students coming up to me and practicing their English, and they actually did a really good job too. So I can tell that they've started that very early on, like in their education. But, and then, of course, like when I went to Germany, it's like everyone wanted to speak to me in English, even though I wanted to try to practice my German because my German's terrible. but so it's definitely a very interesting dynamic. But before we kind of expand on that and kind of to some of the other places, before we leave the subject of Japan, it's, you mentioned food in there, and I don't think we can have a discussion about Japan without talking about the food. So
of course.
Yeah. Before we move on, what would you say was kind of some of your favorite food experiences there. Did you have some favorite Japanese dishes? Any particular restaurants kind of stand out to you? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, gosh, I mean, it is a tough one to wrap up because, I mean, obviously it goes pretty much without saying that the food in Japan is incredible, and you can just find, the freshest fish. You can find this amazing ramen, katsu, and I've always been a big fan of Japanese curry, so that was always a big one for me. But yeah, I mean, all incredible food. And one sort of piece of advice I would give folks is, it's fair to do your research and to check around Instagram and all of this stuff. But what I saw for a lot of people that traveled to Japan is that they had to go to this restaurant or that restaurant. They had to plan out every single meal. And I get the drive behind that, but I just want to say that it's not totally necessary, in my opinion, because especially in a big city, but basically throughout all of Japan, a restaurant won't survive if the food's not good. So that's right. I just found like around every corner, incredible food. So I would just tell people in general, like, not to sweat that aspect of it too much, unless maybe, of course, you plan one or two special meals, like you have to go to some sushi place or something like that. But when you asked the question, the thing that popped into my head, which I guess I'll share just because of that, is I just remembered, as far as good restaurant eating experiences, going to actually Korean barbecue places, which is funny because it's in Japan, but I will say it because it came to my mind. And the reason that it came to my mind is just because I would organize these dinners with friends, just bringing friends from work, from parties, from meetups, from wherever people I had met, and just get everyone around a big table and have an awesome Korean barbecue meal. And you can find, there's like sort of Korean areas around, more Korean-centric areas around Tokyo and of course around the country. But in general, there's Korean barbecue places everywhere as well. So that to me like popped into my head for a specific experience. I think the chain that we went, I think it's called Tonchan or something like that. I can't remember exactly, but I think that's the name. So that comes to mind. But in general, like, I could probably talk to you about every meal that I had there, right? Because it was just like consistently so good. And I really miss that. And that's a huge part of life there. So it's a good topic to bring up.
Yeah, well, going along with your point, talking about how, for any restaurant to survive, the food has to be good. And one thing I've noticed was pretty much like a lot of the restaurants there, especially like locally owned and operated ones, they would source a lot of like local produce, for their ingredients. And because I had noticed that about like many of the cities, that like the cities, you would have like a good like chunk that's buildings, and then you have like a good chunk of like agricultural space, and then followed by like more buildings. So you kind of had that good mixed. And I remember one of the first like major kind of interesting dining experiences that I had was in Osaka. My professor, who I called sensei, he like lived in Japan for like 5 years, spoke the language fluently. And I don't know, he must have known about this place in advance, but he's leading me and my classmates down this like dark alleyway. And I'm like looking around, I'm like, something about to go down here. I mean, where are we going? And then he like walks up to the side of this like building that's completely like just like plain building, and he opens the sliding door, and there's a restaurant inside, and actually a really nice one. And this was a restaurant that specialized in okonomiyaki. And and so that was my first okonomiyaki experience. And my gosh, I felt like I had just been missing out for the first 25 years of my life, until I finally had it. So
yeah, I love that dish. It's an amazing dish. And you can, different places say that it's the authentic dish of Osaka or Hiroshima. And, then there's the monjayaki, which is a Tokyo version. And I love this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was pretty amazing. What I thought was like a sketchy moment in the beginning turned out to be one of the most fulfilling dining experiences that I've ever had. So that was nice. That was pretty cool. And then of course I also really enjoyed the kaiten sushi restaurants. We went to one in I believe Matsuyama. Yeah, near Matsuyama, I believe, that or Okayama, one of the two. And I just remember, man, I just went on a rampage, and I must have stacked like 17 plates before
Nice.
before we called it a day. I can't remember how much I paid, but I just kind of remembered the waitress coming up and like getting a little bit wide eyed when she saw how many plates I stacked, and she's counting them up, to give me my
Yeah.
bill. So yeah, it was
If,
pretty interesting.
if you're surprising her, then you're doing a good job.
Okay, well, good, I'm glad, and I'm sure that's a big compliment, to those in the kitchen, that I'm just going crazy.
Oh, of
Because,
course. Yeah.
because you know how it is with kaiten sushi places. You can get something off the conveyor belt, or we had the touch screen, and we can order something special, and they'd send the little Shinkansen, down to stop at my table. So. An absolutely brilliant concept, in my opinion.
Yes.
So
No,
sure.
I love that too. And there are so many varieties, and it's cool to like some places have them making the sushi right in the middle of the seat, the table area, kind of around them. And so you just call out like what you want, and then they'll repeat it and bring, send it over to you, or like it's super fun experience. And I remember at the beginning too, not really being sure what I was supposed to do when I was done. I was just kind of like looking around, and then I realized, okay, yeah, they have to come over and count the plates. So after that, then you feel like a local, but at first I was, bumbling around.
Oh yeah.
So,
Oh yeah. For sure. All right, man. Well, you kind of filled us in a little bit on what led you to be an expatriate in Japan. You said you wanted to have that, local experience of actually being there, compared to like the first couple of times you just went there as a tourist. So what kind of like led you to move out of Japan and start living as an expatriate in other countries? Like, when does that kind of fall in the timeline, and what sort of led to that decision?
yeah, so I moved to Japan in 2014, and I was living in Tokyo. I lived there ultimately for 2 years. And basically, my plan was not to leave after 2 years. It was to try to stay there for as long as I could, and as long as it made sense, I guess. And what happened was the first year at the job was great. So I did get a job there. I was working at ASICS or ASICS, depending on where you're from, the sportswear company. I was working there in a digital marketing team.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, so it was a really cool experience, a really great opportunity to be able to get there and to be in my dream country. And at first, for the first year, it was fantastic. But then things started changing at the company, and ultimately the situation was going to be either I would, one, have to move back to the US, to Boston, which I hadn't lived in before. And I visited there a few times, nothing wrong with the city or anything. I just didn't really feel that I was a fit there. And also I wanted to keep living abroad. So that didn't really work for me. The second thing would be to do something totally different at the company. And also I still wanted to pursue my career in product management at the time. And that wasn't really that interesting. Or I had to find another job. And so I looked at a lot of jobs in Japan, in Tokyo. And I got to many final rounds. I even got an offer at one point that was then reneged upon by the company due to their budgeting problems and things like this. So I had lots of headaches with trying to find the next job there. So after many months of trying and seeing this job at my current company, probably not lasting too long. And I was also on an annual renewing contract, which meant that next time I was coming up due, I wasn't too sure how it would turn out given how everything was going. I thought, maybe I should start looking outside of Japan. Maybe I should just think about other options. And I had taken a trip for over 2 months around Europe before I moved to Tokyo. And during that trip, I visited Berlin, and it really stuck out in my mind. One of the few cities among the 19 I think I visited in those 9 weeks that really stuck out in my head. And I thought, maybe this is the place for me. Maybe this is the next spot. And so I always kind of had it in the back of my mind. And so as things looked like they weren't going to work out long-term in Japan, I thought maybe I'll just contact some people, see what I can do with Berlin. And turns out that the first person I contacted got me that job. So it like all came together. And from a universal kind of fate perspective, I can't say that, that was kind of obvious to me, I guess. And
yeah, it was how often does it just fall into place on the first go, right?
Exactly. And after months of trying in Japan, and it definitely wasn't falling into place for me, it just seemed like the obvious answer, and it was. But it doesn't mean that I don't miss Japan. Like I absolutely do. Maybe the future will lead there. Who knows? But at least that was the end of that chapter. But again, going back to my university days. So I'd been studying Japanese since I was 12. I was all about Japan. And then I ended up doing the study abroad in Singapore. And that was because of the credits that I needed. So I couldn't get all the business. I was doing business in Japanese, so I couldn't get all the business credits that I needed to be able to graduate on time in the Japanese program, which is also a different school year, going from April to March. So different school year and everything. So I went to Singapore instead, and it showed me that I could be successful in a totally different country, different environment, different, well, kind of region of the world, even in Southeast Asia, quite different from, let's say, East Asia. But tons of travel there, met a lot of great friends. And so that really showed me there's tons more of the world to see. And I had lots of friends in my Japanese studies days that were only focused on Japan. I realized that wasn't true for me. I was much more about seeing the world. And so all of that led to, well, my dream is to be in Japan. I achieved that, but unfortunately it doesn't look like it's going to last. So what's next? And that's what sort of made me think about Berlin. And then since then I've moved to Portugal. I'm sure we'll talk on those things, but it's just kind of this evolving search for the next, I don't know, next chapter, the next step, the next, whatever I'm searching for at that time, which also changes over the years. But that's kind of what led to my Japan dream. I finally made it to Japan and then moved on. So maybe it seems a little strange, but I suppose it's also my openness and desire for those new experiences.
Right. Well, you made an interesting point earlier that I kind of want to expand on. You mentioned that you had an opportunity to continue a job within your company in Boston, but that would involve you having to come back to the States, because I think there's kind of like a thing when it comes to being an expatriate where once you've kind of experienced the one time, it kind of has this curious effect within you that just makes you want to see, okay, well, what else is out there? What other opportunities? Where else can I live? And it was like that for me. I lived in West Africa for 2 years as a Peace Corps volunteer, and had that experience with living abroad in a developing country, in a small village with no electricity or running water or anything like that. And I remember I came back to the States following that experience, but I had a really, really hard time adjusting just to being back in the US again. Like reverse culture shock just hit me really hard. And I'm like, okay, I need to get abroad again, man. It's just, it's like, I feel like I have to, I'm like an expatriate now. I kind of got to have that experience again. And so within about a year of being back stateside after Peace Corps, I found myself in England studying for my master's degree in archaeology there. And now I'm kind of starting to get that itch again, even though I'm stateside now, I'm starting to get the itch. Well, I might want to go abroad, and I'm actually hoping to do so later this year. More on that later for my listeners in general. But, there is kind of just one of those things where it's like, once you've kind of had a taste for it, mm-hmm. It's just, you kind of want to see where else it can take you. So,
right. Agreed.
Yes. Yeah, so it was Germany next then for you in this case. So, how long were you in Germany for? And I guess just what was the transition like coming from Japan and being in Germany? Because you said there were some differences as far as like the language and cultural dynamics is concerned, but what were some of the other differences that you've kind of had to adjust to when you arrived in Germany?
Yeah, so I was in Japan from 2014 to 2016, and then until 2019 I was in Germany. So 3 years. In Berlin. And I think what surprised me most, and it was especially strong for me in that experience because I was just coming from Japan, because to get some context, in Japan, as you know, I'm sure the idea is that the customer is kind of king, and there's this really polite, at least outwardly very polite culture, and very understanding, very helpful. I know it's kind of a common stereotype of Japan. I think people experience it when they go there for the most part, but that was my experience too. And the challenge in Japan is to break underneath the surface level, social politics, I guess, right. And to get to the core of somebody, or to feel like a local, to feel like an insider outside of sort of past that just initial first impression. When I went to Germany, and I'd visited on my trip in early 2014 before I moved to Tokyo. So it'd been a couple years since I'd been there, but I had this great image of it in mind. keep in mind that I was only there ultimately for 3 days during that trip of 9 weeks, and that was in a lot of cities. So I remember just arriving in Germany, and I had that, it built up in my head like this incredible impression of Berlin. And I was just on the train into the city, coming from the airport, and I was like, is this the same place that that I thought that I was before? It was like, so it was different than I remembered, and that's my own fault for not going back and visiting again and, refreshing my mind before jumping all in. But what really struck me was in the early days, again, compared to what it was like in Japan, where it was very polite, especially in a city like Berlin. I'm not saying this is true for all of Germany. In fact, southern Germany is much more kind of open and friendly relative to northern Berlin in particular. But going to like the prepaid phone place and trying to like ask the guy a question, I couldn't speak any German, and I was apologizing and like tripping over my words. And the guy behind the counter was just staring at me, just like looked like he wanted me to die. Like, just the aggression, outward kind of, I don't know. Yeah. Aggression that you can experience in Berlin was really a shock to me. And it made me have to develop some thicker skin in my time there. And I'm glad that it did, but it was so stark and painful coming from Japan. It's hard to underline that more, but there were some days in the early time, the early time I was in Berlin, where I thought, did I make the right choice here? And I'm glad that I stuck it out for 3 years, but I think 3 years was enough for me. And I also got married there, so my wife as well.
Oh, okay. So is your wife German, if I may ask?
So this is the funny part. She's Japanese, but we met in Germany.
Really? Wow. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. What are the odds? You spent 2 years in Japan and you meet your wife in Germany, of all places. So
exactly. If I could give one takeaway from that, which I think is really important, so I'd like to share it whenever I can, is if for your listeners they're thinking I don't know about relationships and being abroad and so on. I think it's really, really important to be with somebody that's aligned with you as far as being abroad in different countries, traveling, all of that stuff. So I'd say travel together early on. And I would also say it worked out really well for us because we were both outside of our home countries and completely comfortable at that. And so when we talked early in our relationship about where the next spot would be, whenever Germany came to a close, we didn't have firm plans, but we saw that it wasn't the long-term place that we would be. It was never about, is it going to be the US? Is it going to be Japan? It was about, where are we going? Let's do another country. So that ended up for us becoming Portugal. So I think being aligned on those points is really important if travel and living abroad is a core part of your identity and your lifestyle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also I think there's kind of that openness and willingness to make compromises, within yourself too, because right now I'm kind of dealing with a distance relationship. Like my current girlfriend, I met her when I was living in the UK. She's still there. I'm back in the US for a time, but it's just now the compromises for me is to go back to England, to be with her, because, that's kind of the policy I sort of set for myself once I kind of started living and traveling abroad, that had I ever met someone that was from a different country, I would probably just make the jump to be with her in wherever country she's in, unless if she was absolutely insistent on wanting to live in the US.
Right.
But, for the most part, though, it's just the compromise is one that I'm willing to make for the sake of the relationship too. So that's another thing I think for people to keep in mind if they start traveling and if they start relationships while they're either living abroad or traveling abroad for a time or whatever else. It's just like, just think about, keep that in mind, that compromises might have to be made and everything. So yeah.
Definitely.
Right on. All right. So, but kind of talking about Germany a little bit more is you clearly had a much different experience with when I had, you're kind of telling this story about how, you're in the mobile store and, you're kind of getting the death stare from the customer service representative there. When I was in Germany, of course, like I didn't go to Berlin. I went to just some of the other cities. Like I flew into Dresden, then I went to Hanover, and then I spent New Year's in Hamburg, which is a total blast, by the way. So, I mean, I noticed that New Year's celebrations there are pretty intense. Fireworks in city streets and everything. But it's like, when you were in Berlin, you said that's where you were based, but did you get a chance to go out and, I'm assuming you would for 3 years, to see some of the other cities? What were some of the highlights that you remember from your time living there?
Yeah, yeah, and to be clear, my experience was one where indeed I was based and spent most of my time in Berlin. And Berlin, even if you ask German people, Berlin is not Germany, is what they say, because it's this kind of capital city with kind of history, with lots and lots of foreigners moving there now, and just all of these elements come together to make it a totally different experience. So I don't want to scare people away from Berlin or from Germany, but I want to be honest about what I personally encountered and experienced there.
Yeah.
So as far as traveling around Germany, of course did the Oktoberfest thing. I actually did that shortly after arriving. So some friends were visiting from the United States, so we went together. That was an awesome experience. I visited Dresden as well, which is a very nice city. I did Frankfurt and Mainz and Hamburg a bunch of times. I had a friend living there for a while after one of the guys that I went to Oktoberfest with was stationed there for like a year and a half, maybe, or a year with his company. So he was able to like switch offices for just that period of time. So that was really incredible because he's one of my best buds. And I don't know. It took a lot of opportunities for travel. Unfortunately, didn't get to go to Düsseldorf, which is where they have the biggest Japanese population. I would have liked to get back some Japanese food there, but luckily found enough good Japanese food in Berlin as well. But also, I should say that I spent a lot of the time that I was living in Berlin just traveling around Europe as well. So tons of trips to Eastern Europe, especially because I'd seen so much of Western Europe on that 2-month trip I mentioned back in 2014. So of course I did see some of those cities again, or some different cities around Western Europe, but I also took that opportunity to go to Poland a bunch, to go to Serbia, Montenegro, we went to Ukraine, went to see Chernobyl. Like that stuff was amazing. So for me, it was totally seeing also that side of Eastern Europe and just add to the list of countries I've been to.
Right. Well, with you being based in Berlin and in Germany in general, Central Europe, you're in a pretty good hub to basically just like expand outward to see, other places within Europe too. So
it was strategic from that standpoint. You have cheap flights. Berlin's a big city now I think they finally opened this airport that took like 10 years plus to finally open.
Really?
It's been this like awful stain on I don't know, Berlin or on Germany to have this airport be closed. But I think it's fine. What I heard is it's finally open. But before that, there were 2 airports that were both kind of small and frankly not great, but they went a lot of places. So just getting to do that. I also took the opportunity with a company that I was working for there to do 1 week in different cities, like per month. So it was a more remote friendly workplace, even work from home and everything. So it's pretty much the same working from home or getting to go to some other city for a week and just post up there in Airbnb, see the sights in the morning, at night, grab some food and also be able to work. So that was really cool. And I'm just glad I took those opportunities while I had the chance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you got to capitalize, being in that central location. And, it was like that for me too. When I was in, when I was in the Gambia in West Africa, didn't really have too much means to see a whole lot around West Africa. I did make it up to Morocco, which was a total blast. And then of course, when I was living in England, granted that I had to get a master's degree within a year. So that took up a good amount of my time. Because like when I moved out there, I'm like, oh, I'm moving to England. I could see this. I could see this. I could do that. But I'm like, oh crap. I'm a student. I got to get a master's degree within half the time that it takes most people to do it. So I got to work this weekend. So, but I still found one-way flights to, to Germany and I also went to like Dubai and Israel and things like that when I was there. So I got in some travels, when I was there. Right. But so you were there for 3 years and, kind of the same question that I posed earlier about Japan. What was it that led you to ultimately leave Germany and now you're based in Portugal? What was it that sort of incited that transition?
Yeah, so there were, again, a couple of different things, but to try to give an overview, a summary of them. So my wife and I, even when we were dating in the early days, as I mentioned, we were talking about where would be next for us. And we talked about a couple of options, but we quickly came upon the idea of Portugal. My wife had never visited, but I had been there in that Europe trip I talked about before. I really had a good impression of it, but she had read some things, saw some things. Anyway, we thought, let's go and check it out. So we went for 1 week in October of 2018, and we went to a couple of days to Porto, a couple of days to Lisbon, but really with, of course, seeing as much as we could, but at the same time, having an angle and a view toward our travel to see if this is a place that we could live. And so to that end, we absolutely loved it. We thought, this is a place for us, and we were still kind of trying to decide between the two cities. And then, yeah, as far as like how it all ended up coming into place for the next year. So yeah, to be completely honest, I've had a lot of companies lay me off. So I've been working in tech startups, and it's just not the safest place to be working. And so I've had like 3 layoffs in my career, and I've also had 3 other companies that I've quit out of just frustration with how they're being run and looking for something better. And so, yeah, it ended up happening that I got the news of another layoff in April of 2019. So I got to kind of decide when I would leave that, which was June. I decided to stay till June. So they were basically pulling out investment in the product that I was working on. And my wife at that time, we just got married in Japan then in May of 2019, and we had a party in June of 2019. So kind of all of that was coming together. So we had the legal marriage and a party, and we had the means to be able to go together to a new country. And in her case, she was finishing a program at a bakery in Germany in August of 2019. So altogether, it was just like the perfect time, for us to either we stay and we really invest and we stay in Germany, in Berlin, or we make a move. And yeah, long story short, after a lot of job interviews, I found a job here in Porto, in Portugal, and we made that move in November of 2019.
Right on. So just good time for a fresh start, basically. It all kind of came together. So right on.
I guess I should probably say some of our thinking, because I guess that's what you were alluding to, is like, so it did all come together that way, but why not invest in Berlin? Because that was maybe the easy option, is really that honestly, we found over time the things that were attractive about Berlin at first became a bit more hard to deal with. the DIY fun grunginess of the city, which was super fun and awesome when I was just moving there, kind of I think I was living in a great area, but it's like a super party heavy friendly area. And as a result, like as you grow out of the party scene you get that like married life, then it feels a little different to be woken up by techno music at 4 a.m. And, and I think also the Berlin weather is pretty rough. I mean, yeah, maybe I'm sure there's worse weather in other places, but for me, that was the worst kind of winters, very long, gray, cold winters that I've ever had experienced. And I think after a couple of years, both of us were a little just tired of all that and looking to indeed a place like Portugal that's warmer and, a bit more chill and a bit more down to earth. And every place has its pros and cons, and every place has its chapter in my life or, its time. But I think it was maybe just time for us to move on.
Yeah, I mean, it's like that a lot of times too, like you said, you come to the end of one chapter, you're ready to start like a new one. And I'm sure probably, maybe in a year or two, you might be thinking that, okay, Portugal was nice, but let's see what else is out there. Let's see what other opportunities that we can seek, and it's it definitely, makes for some excitement too, just, having like a new fresh change, a new fresh perspective or whatever else, for sure. That's kind of the joys of being an expat, so,
exactly.
And some of the challenges too, because it can take quite a bit to just uproot everything and move. And, even from something as simple as like getting a new phone number or, having to do all the visa paperwork and everything like that too. It can be a lot of hoops to jump through to make those transitions, it's kind of what I want to talk about a little bit. And, we're probably not going to be able to cover everything. So I'll just kind of ask you just to give us a little bit of an overview. But I mean, if our listeners, they got to hear some stories from you living abroad, they got to hear some of my stories of living abroad, but they might be thinking, well, how do I do it too? I mean, where do I get started if I wanted to take interest in living abroad? And, we may not be able to get, different countries are going to have different requirements, but let's just kind of give like a little bit of an overview. Where would someone, what are some things to take into consideration for anyone listening who might want to look into becoming an expat themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to start with what you want to be doing and what you want your life to be there. I mean, whether that means that you have to work, or maybe you're already wealthy, or you have a retirement coming, there's all these different elements. So it's hard to give an overall answer to it. But I would say, think about how much money that you'll be making and from where, and think about the cost of living in the place that you want to go. And as long as you can make those two things work, even for a short period of time, then you can get that first start. And so I would say, for example, depends on what country you're coming from and where you want to go and your age, but there are things like working holidays, a little bit harder to pull off as an American. But if listeners are coming from other places, that's definitely a possibility. You could go for a language school program for a couple of months to get feet on the ground, of course, get more familiar with the language, with the culture. You could go into grad school or even do undergrad. I've heard of such things naturally in other countries, and you have to figure out then the language requirements or what requirements to get in, but you can make that work as you have. There's passive income opportunities as well for people that are freelancers or making money through real estate, or of course, if they have their own businesses that they're doing online, there's more and more people that want to do things like this. And naturally, if folks have a lot of money to invest, there's golden visas. That's probably cost prohibitive to most people, but at the end of the day, it's surprising how many different options and ways that there are to get abroad. And you can volunteer. I mean, you can do it more in a travel type way where they have work away and some different programs like this to be able to do some work or to help around a farm or do something to be able to get your food, to get your board. So tons of options, and it naturally depends on, again, where do you want to go? What do you want to be doing? For me, I had countries in mind. So Japan first, and then Berlin. It wasn't even a country. It wasn't Germany. It was actually Berlin, the city. And then it was Portugal. And I really wanted to be progressing in my career. So in order to be able to do that, I had to find the right job in the right country, the right opportunity, and just bring it all together. That's difficult. There are easier routes. There's English teaching, there's volunteering, there's studying. So just wanted to, I guess, at a very high level, kind of give a brief overview of some potential options, and just recommend that people really look through and think through what they want, but then look through everything that's possible and available to them to make it happen.
Right. And then I think also, like, if I may add to that, it's also like, well, what goals do you have? What are you hoping to like achieve or accomplish from like living abroad? Like for me, going to West Africa for Peace Corps, it was simply just to be of service. I've done like chapters in my life where I was trying to serve others. I did 4 years in the Marine Corps. And then of course, Peace Corps was another means for me to continue to be of service to others. And then, going to England, it was for grad school, but both one of those and were totally different dynamics, like you mentioned, and had different things to take in consideration. Just going to West Africa for Peace Corps, I had pretty much housing arranged for me. I was making a stipend and everything like that. So from a financial perspective, there wasn't really much I had to worry about to do that. But it was totally different when I went to a developed country like England, where going for a master's degree, and again, having to do it in like a year, pretty much I wasn't really allowed to have a full-time job or anything like that. They basically kind of said that if you're going to come here and do this program, you should have like some sort of like financial means already in place to do this, whether it's through financial aid that you're getting from like loans or scholarships or whatever. Me, since I was in the military, I was fortunate enough to have the GI Bill cover a lot of my tuition. So I only had to worry about living expenses for that endeavor. So, it's definitely stuff like that to take into consideration. And then of course you have like your other admin and logistical stuff. You got to get a visa, depending on what it is that you're doing. Like I got a student visa when I was in England. And then of course I got like a work visa to go to the Gambia. So, so I guess it's like, what's your goals? Like, what is it you want to achieve when you're traveling abroad too? I believe is some other things to take in consideration as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you can accomplish maybe what, for people out there, maybe they can accomplish what they're looking for through just taking a long trip around whatever area, or just staying in one city for a couple months and just seeing the sights. It depends. Do you really want to live somewhere long term? Because as soon as you get past the tourist visa, then I recommend it, but the bureaucracy, the challenges, the integration, the language, all of this stuff becomes all that much more important, and it's much more difficult. I like this life. I like to have my base abroad, to be able to, be in a different culture, have totally different experiences, be able to travel a lot in a new region. All of these things are vital for me, and I wouldn't trade that for anything at this point. But it is a big, it's a lot of work, and it's a big investment. And so I think, once again, looking at your goals, what you want to try to accomplish and how you can make it happen, you'd be surprised at the options out there.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So what I want to ask you about next is, you've had all this experience with traveling and living abroad, for the times that you had. And, one thing about travel and adventure, and in, our case, being an expatriate, there's a lot of things that we take away from it. We learn a lot about ourselves. We pick up a lot of valuable life lessons along the way. So what were some of those big takeaways and life lessons for you? And I know that's a little bit of a loaded question, considering your experiences. There's probably a lot of them, but what kind of comes to mind?
Yeah, I think the main one for me, which has just ultimately been reinforced by this number of years abroad and so many moves to different countries, is just the fact that I can accomplish my dreams. I can be self-sufficient. I can be independent. If I put my mind to something, then I can make it happen. And that happened with Japan. It happened with Germany, and now it's happened in Portugal. And who knows what the future holds? But I think it's that understanding of yourself, understanding of the world, understanding of what's possible, and to continue to be able to make those moves and to be comfortable, independent, living the life that is one that, like, your dreams always change, but I've lived the life that I was dreaming of when I was young, living in Japan. And then when I was in Japan, dreaming about traveling around Europe was also in my head. So then I did that. And you never know, again, you never know what the future holds. But I think that for me has been the main takeaway.
Yeah, and it's a good reminder of what it is that you're capable of, isn't it? Because, you go to these countries, especially like when you're there for the first several days or weeks, you're by yourself. You don't really have a network of people to help you out if things go wrong. It's like, if you face a problem, well, figure it out. You better figure it out, because, you're on your own. And you got to be able to be a problem solver for yourself. So figure it out, Exactly.
And I think there's still problems that, of course, crop up all the time. It's just life. But recognizing how many of those I've gotten through, and it's a hard road being abroad. It's harder than being in your home country and the language maybe that you're used to, or the culture and everything. The things work the way that you expect them to because you're used to them. And so it hasn't been always easy, but recognizing that every hurdle that's come up, I've managed to somehow find a way around, even if it's not what I expected at the beginning, just lends more credibility or more, belief in myself to be able to overcome the next one.
All right. Right on, man. All right. Before we get into the wrap up of our conversation, because we're starting to wind down on time, I do want to give you a couple of minutes to tell us a little bit more about Expat Empire and kind of what you have available there. You got the podcast, you got some other resources out there and available. So, by all means, take a couple of minutes and tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the opportunity. So I am working now full-time on Expat Empire, which is expatempire.com. I started about 2.5 years ago. As a way to share my knowledge and hopefully inspire people to be able to live abroad. It started with a book that I wrote called Passport to Working in Japan, which is, of course, about my time working in Japan, not just the stories like some that we've shared today, but also tips and advice and real actionable information for people to be able to get to Japan if they want to. So it started with that and the launch of the website back in 2018. And then I added on the Expat Empire podcast, which I talked to a lot of expats similar to your podcast here today, and blog posts. And I have a meetup group here in Porto, for example. But most importantly, I also help people in a very hands-on, individualized, personalized way to help them to get abroad. So it's really consulting services, it's coaching services to help people where they are today. If they have a dream of living abroad, whether that's as a digital nomad, retiring abroad, finding a job, a local job internationally, all of that and more we do through Expat Empire. So there's all that information about all of our services and everything on the website, expatempire.com. So you can go there and get our free ebook, Top 10 Tips for Moving Abroad, which I wrote about just all my experiences over the last more than half decade. And also, you can schedule a free 30-minute call to talk through your situation with me. And we can see, of course, and give you some insights, some advice and feedback and figure out how it might make sense for us to be able to work together to help you to achieve your dreams.
Okay, right on. And I'll get all that linked up in the show notes for this episode so listeners can go and find it all there.
Awesome.
All right. So moving into the wrap up of our conversation, another thing I always ask my guests to do is to issue a challenge to our listeners because stories are great, information's great, but if our listeners follow it up with action, then it's pretty much all for naught, right? So what I want to ask you is, what challenge would you issue to our listeners for them to go out there and start living a more adventurous life?
Yeah, for an adventurous life in general, what I've discovered, and it's difficult in this current climate and situation, so of course, maybe wait a couple months or till next year. But what I tend to do as far as my travels and to try to be as adventurous as possible is I look at the flights going from wherever I am at the time. And of course, I look at prices and things like that in places where I haven't been. But if I'm trying to go somewhere new, I find something that looks interesting. I do very little research on it and I just book the flight. I book it and then I figure it out. And that just takes away so much of the, should I go here? Should I go there? Do I really want to do that? What about this date? It answers all of those doubts and concerns and questions. And sometimes it's only the day before or after even I arrive in a place where I actually figure out where it is exactly on the map. Mm-hmm. I'm at that level, and I think, of course, it comes with a lot of experience, and living abroad, maybe, or let's say outside of the United States, gives you the opportunity to make some of those flights cheaper than other people might be able to do. So there are, if you only get one trip a year, then maybe do a bit more research. But I think that would be just a great way for people to be able to move forward without getting stuck in the what if scenarios. And I think that's where people get bogged down a bit. And just quickly to add on that, for people looking to work abroad, for example, just look for job opportunities. Just start looking. And because what I always found too is, do I want to live in this city? Do I want to live in this country? What about this? What about that? And if you can't find the opportunity to get there, and for example, if you want to work to find a job, then there's no real point in comparing or contrasting. You're just spending a lot of time spinning your wheels. And so I think actually making real steps to send out your resume, to find companies, to tap into your network will get you that much closer and keep you out of this fantasy land and more grounded in the reality of what's possible.
Yeah, right on. Kind of going back to your first point, that's actually a first to come up on the podcast. And I appreciate that point because, I think there's oftentimes, it's that paralysis by analysis that we often face, where we have so many choices of where we can travel to in this day and age. I mean, maybe not quite so much right now, but generally speaking, we do. And so they say, and they just kind of some people tend to get caught up in well, where am I going to go next? And eventually they don't end up making a decision because there's maybe a little bit of information overwhelmed because there's so many places that you could go to. So it's pick a place and just go, otherwise you're just going to stay stagnant. And that sometimes, it makes for a little bit of excitement too, when you don't do a whole lot of research, because with the access to information we have is you can basically research everything there is to know about a place, even down to what you can order at restaurants and stuff like that. And I think it kind of sort of takes away from the adventurous appeal that I think many early travelers had, where there's that, sense of mystery and kind of just figuring places out as you go and more or less discovering places. And I put that in quotations, of course.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
but yeah, it's just
I totally
planning,
agree. Yeah. I mean, and that's, I think a downside. I mean, of course, maybe I'm the more old school and traveler of not needing to Instagram everything and not needing to look at Instagram for all my inspiration. But I think when you get into that, it's like, oh, this ramen looks slightly better than this one, or, but actually if you just are walking around Japan, and this is the thing that gets me too, is like, if you plan every meal, that means you need to be at that meal at that time. And then your whole, you can't just be so spontaneous. And I think just being able to walk down the street, wherever you are, find a place that looks great, welcoming, like nice people, a small little shop is going to probably lead to a lot more memorable experiences than just getting that quote unquote perfect photo. So,
yeah, agreed.
Absolutely. But that's maybe the old travel veteran perspective than maybe the younger generation.
The pre-Instagram and heavy social media use travel advice there. So
exactly.
Right on, man. All right. So what I have for you next is my final three. These are three fun questions that I like to ask all my guests at the end of the show. And we're going to do this kind of rapid fire. Yeah, so kind of just, whatever comes to mind. All right. And you might have already answered some of these questions already, but here we go anyway. And the first of those is, what is your favorite place that you've been to so far?
Yes. Okay. So I'll try to give it in 2 sentences. My favorite places are the places that generally I've tried to live so far. So that's the easiest answer: Japan, Germany, and Portugal. But if I were to pick another one that really stuck in my head was Vietnam. I really loved that trip. It was so cool. I was there for, I think, 12 days. And I would say everyone should visit.
All right. Awesome. Cool. And the next question, what is one thing on your bucket list that you have yet to do?
I would say one I've been thinking about recently is I'd love to spend a good amount of time traveling around Turkey when things open up, and maybe it's a bit better time to do it. But that's a country where there's a lot that I'd love to see.
Yeah, same here. And that was a country that I was hoping to go to recently as well. Well, I definitely want to have the experience of literally walking across 2 continents, because, in Istanbul, you can walk from Europe into Asia. So that's, that would be cool. I don't know. That just sounds so cool to me,
yeah.
to be honest.
Absolutely.
So, okay. All right. And the last question, and this is a 2-parter. What is your favorite animal, and have you seen this animal in the wild?
Yes. So I gathered that you're a diver as well. So I will give a diving answer. So I did swim with a sea turtle. I mean, I don't know, maybe more specific than any description than that. I don't know, but that was an incredible experience and was super friendly to people as far as swimming next to you, kind of sitting in the rocks, just staring, and you could get really close. So that was pretty amazing. I did that. I believe that was in the Great Barrier Reef when I was diving there many years ago now, but that was very cool.
All right, cool. Awesome, man. All right. Well, David, that's it. That's pretty much all the questions that I have for you today. But before we call it a day here, let's just recap once again where our listeners can go to connect with you. Like I said, you got Expat Empire, you got the podcast, and I'm sure you're out there in the social media space just as well too. So fill us in on all the particulars as to where our listeners can find you.
Yeah, definitely come to expatempire.com. Check out the free ebook that I mentioned before, as well as setting up a call or just reaching out if you have any questions or thoughts. And we're on Facebook, Instagram, pretty much everywhere, Twitter at Expat Empire.
Okay. All right. And I'll get all those, like I mentioned, linked up in the show notes so the listeners can go and find them there. All right. Well, David, I want to thank you very much for taking the time for joining me today. This is definitely a lot of fun kind of taking this trip down memory lane. And, I like that you and I, we've, kind of covered the same ground for the most part and got to have the similar types of experiences with living abroad. So I just appreciate you being here and sharing all your stories and insights with myself and the listeners, man. It's been great.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel the same. Good to find another Japanophile in our midst. And look forward to keeping in touch.
Okay. All right. Right on, man.
Right on. Thanks.